Okay, so for my grading and assessment research project, I chose authentic assessment. So what does authentic assessment look like? So one of the definitions in the description for authentic assessment, it's a type of assessment where students are asked to perform real-world tasks that demonstrate meaningful application of essential knowledge and skills. Another quick little bit about it is that its aim is to assess many different kinds of literacy abilities in contexts that really resemble actual real-world situations where they can use their abilities and skills. So, for example, authentic assessment may ask students to read texts, to write for a purpose about meaningful topics, and to participate in literacy tasks such as writing books, keeping journals, writing letters, or revising like pieces of writing until it works for like an intended reader. It's really to have, the aim really of authentic assessment is to have as natural of a process as possible. And it also really values the thinking behind the work as much as the finished product. So it's really about the process of what's going on instead of being able just to perform a task. So why authentic assessment? Moving away from current standardized testing. So one of the reasons for this shift to incorporate more authentic assessment into the classroom comes from growing thoughts among educators and researchers and even policymakers that current standardized tests really don't tap into a lot of the skills and abilities that students need to develop in order to be successful in their future and in their life and in jobs. So for decades, standardized test scores have been used as a means to measure student learning, when really they're not measuring what the students know and what they can do. So criticisms against standardized testing, pretty much the opposite of authentic assessment, would be that tests don't really reflect accurate information about learning. It's just more about regurgitating information. They're also pretty biased against minorities or people with limited English and low-income families. A lot of the tests are only in English, and a lot of lower-level readers or non-English speakers wouldn't be able to read a lot of those tests, which gives them an unfair advantage. The standardized tests also focus on instruction, or they focus instruction on segmented skills instead of higher-order thinking and creativity. They influence teachers to use class time to prepare students for test taking instead of actually focusing on content and letting the students learn what they need to learn. And tests often don't match curriculum being taught in class. So there's really a disconnect between what we should be teaching the students and what we are. Also, just really quick about another criticism against standardized testing is that test scores sometimes can put a ceiling on expectations for students, and that will give them difficulties because they'll have a hard time overcoming a lot of those expectations. Because tests are used by school systems to like satisfy a need for accountability. Sometimes those distract the public from really seeing the social issues that are influencing test scores. So the importance of authentic assessment. So like we said before, it's really connected to real-world skills that are contextual to everyday life. Authentic assessment prepares students to frame problems, find information, evaluate alternatives, create ideas and products, and really invent new answers to tricky questions or problems. It's not really giving them the answer, it's letting them find it out on their own. Authentic assessment allows students to practice the skills they will need for future occupations in real life jobs. This is especially important today there's so many growing jobs in information and technology, and those jobs usually require high developed intellectual and technical skills. So even lower skill jobs require technical training and flexibility. So you can see where this could really come in handy especially with the problem-solving aspect, as students are developing their own problems or their own solutions to problems presented to them. Authentic assessment also allows students to have an active role that engages their capacities to structure tasks, produce ideas, and again, solve problems. So a major goal of authentic assessment is to help students develop the capacity to evaluate their own work, to revise, modify, and redirect their energies, taking initiative to assess their own progress. This is huge in terms of self-directed work and self-motivated improvement, which is usually required of all people in real-world situations. So you can see how beneficial this would be. So some examples of authentic assessment, really quick. So develop maybe a project that demonstrates student knowledge of scientific methodology by using it in a certain field. They can engage in an ethical or social issue by, you could have them debate or write an opinion piece, analyze a film or book that raises really important or problematic moral issues. And then, for example, we talked a lot about literacy, but for math, investigate real problems that require high levels of critical thinking, questioning, listening, analysis. It really allows them to hypothesize and then make predictions, collect their own data, search for patterns among that data, and then they can use their own data to verify their conclusions. So evaluating authentic assessment. So a way to evaluate authentic assessment, because I think a lot of people from the research I read, it's difficult to really put a number on it. It's really hard to put a quantitative number on it. But for examples, in terms of literacy, so portfolios and reflective journals. If you had a portfolio or a reflective journal, it would include something like poetry, scanned images, quotations, and other teacher-selected materials that allow students to really reflect on what they're learning in a certain content area. So, for example, in the journal, students would be required to write a paragraph, draw a picture, or construct some sort of artifact that would allow the teacher to see how students are interpreting all of this information that's being given to them. And then within that portfolio, you could evaluate their writing skills. Students' work from portfolios is read, and feedback can be provided on the content, the level of reflection that they've given in the work. And then also you can evaluate their sentence structure and their grammatical elements. Then suggestions are made, which will help to improve, or they are given more prompts to help them think more deeply about the information or the content if they're struggling with that. And then feedback over time is provided concerning the changes that the students have made from their suggestions, the previous suggestions. So there's really a correlation between teacher feedback and student performance. This creates a basis really for evaluating small changes in the student's understanding of content, because teachers can go back and see what they're getting and what they're not, and then students are a part of their learning. And then changes in students' ability to write logical arguments of a given topic are really seen through that too. And then you're also able to evaluate reading skills through these authentic assessments if you're using portfolios or reflection journals. You can locate, for example, students usually when they're doing their research in a content area, from the research that I read, a lot of students, even if they're at lower levels, they tend to want to read at higher levels to find information. So this shows that low-level readers really have an interest in reading higher-level texts, which really inspires them to want to be able to read at higher levels so that they can get this information for their work. This can be used, their interest can be used to encourage students to increase their vocabulary, and it can also increase their their interest to work on reading skills that they would typically avoid if they were nervous. Now there's a purpose behind it. So you can see where it comes full circle. This starting with the content and having them build on their learning over time, which wants them to learn more, or which encourages them to learn more, and they want to practice higher level reading skills. So those are just a few examples of how you could evaluate students' work in portfolios or reflective journals through the use of authentic assessment. So authentic assessment really affects all educators. Authentic assessment allows teachers to really see how the students are learning and what they're learning versus how they perform on a test. Teachers can also better target student needs independently instead of just seeing them as a number on a results page from one of the standardized tests. They can actually see detailed work and slowly help the student improve. Teachers can focus on teaching content instead of test-taking skills. As we said before, one of the negatives about standardized tests was that they take away from real teaching time in the classroom. And then also, it affects all educators because it does require a shift in thinking for a lot of teachers. A lot of teachers may still really like standardized testing. It's not as much work in terms of feedback for students and managing how to get all that feedback to students. But I think it's really beneficial for the students overall as a way to help them create better critical thinking skills, analyzing skills, and improve their learning overall in all content areas.